there's different cultural implications for entrepreneurship. But right now we're trying to focus our research on highlighting these emerging trends and also making sure that folks are aware. An issue for a Black-owned business is not necessarily the same as for a women-owned business. It's not the same for an Asian-owned business. There are issues, there are barriers that are common threads, but there are things that we need to be looking at that are looking at incentive impacts for particular groups when we go to foreign policy.
Mm-hmm. I guess you can't tell us when Title III is going to come through.
You'll have to ask the SEC about that, right?
The policy side, I think they're phenomenal, some phenomenal opportunities. I mean, I can just imagine Jason and Woody, just in terms of being pulled into that whole policy process and then looking at different legislations. I mean, these have been interesting times. There's been Jobs Act, but then there's been, Dodd-Frank. Some would argue for and against, and there have been, different arguments there. But I think a lot of the existing policies can even just be amended. And there's one in particular I've taken interest in. So, I've looked up this new market tax credit legislation, a particular building that is in downtown Atlanta that I invested in, a minority partner. And we received over $20 million in new market, nearly $20 million in new market tax credits. And the way new market tax credits work, accredited investors can invest in these qualified investments that are to create jobs in low-income communities. Now, I think we have to start looking at some of the abuse of the policies because our particular building, some of you've been to, it sits downtown across from the Ritz-Carlton and from Georgia Pacific and from, the 191 and the Commerce Club, which are prestigious private clubs. They're pulling on the periphery of downtown economic hardship to qualify as a low-income community. And so it's not creating the jobs that it's supposed to, but it's giving this 7-year, 37% tax break to, AngelList type accredited investors. So I could look at the policy and I just poo-poo it on all day, but I just said, why don't we change it? So I'm co-sponsoring a bill called the ANGEL Act, which is an acronym for Accelerating Neighborhood Growth via Equity and Lending. It's a simple amendment to the new markets tax credits legislation that will allow accredited investors to also invest in incubators and accelerators, whereby 30% of the co-founders that are in those incubators and accelerators are from underserved and low-income communities. That could then disrupt the statistics in terms of what goes to women-owned, equity that goes to women-owned, equity that goes to minority businesses. So, that's me looking at existing legislation, seeing the abuse of the legislation, and then correcting it. And I think all economic policy, particularly even on the research side, we can look at that economic policy and start shifting it. It's easy to make small amendments than it is to just create something from scratch that's bigger.
But I think one limitation that we have is for both making good policy as well as doing good research is not having good data. And we really need to spend a lot more of our resources and efforts creating data so that we can do good research and make good informed policy decisions.
Yes.
We just approved an annualized survey of business owners that we're funding. Kauffman Foundation is funding the Census Bureau to annualize the survey of business owners because our statistical system is such that we get very old, lagged data that's not timely and uninformative and pretty much useless for making policies when the latest data that we have from the federal government is from 2007.
I'll let you finish, but I'm so excited to hear that news.
So that will help, but we need to create constituencies that are going to demand of our government that we need good data.
Yes. Yeah. And I'm really excited about what you're doing, Richard, too, on the crowdfunding data out there, because there's a lot of numbers being thrown out, and some of it is somewhat self-serving, with some of the numbers we've talked about before on the platforms. And we're going to need numbers that we can trust by sources that we can all, know are really there just to provide the good data. And it's going to be really important.
The founders of both Lending Club and Prosper talk about transparency and reputation in terms of creating transparency about the data and what's actually going on. And I think as we do that with other crowdfunding sites, in venture capital, in angel financing. We're going to just make a whole lot of, increase the credibility of what we're doing.
Are we going to get transparency in venture capital?
We're working on it. We're working on it. There's a project.
What questions do we have from the group? Yes.
So, I guess, I'm hoping I heard you wrong, but I probably heard you correctly. So angel lists, they don't capture, I mean, they have to be capturing the demographics of their agents.
No.
They're just not transparent about it?
They say they are not capturing gender, and that when the question actually came up at the launch event in February, and partly was because we presented there and it caused a huge stir about whether or not you needed a platform to unlock women angels. And so they did respond and said they didn't capture it, but they did, I think, they went through and looked at 300 names and as a sample, and they had 9% were women. Now, that wasn't even people who had invested.
Yeah, I was just going to say, that's people on the platform, and that could be very misleading because most of those people don't invest.
Yeah.
Well, and it's not necessarily a representative sample. Right?
No, not at all. Not at all.
They may have picked the typical data set that they thought was the best.
Well, we've had that problem with venture capital for years, and so I don't know if it's better now, but when I was at Kauffman Foundation, that was their argument, that they did not measure, they couldn't capture it, how many VCs were women or men. And at that point we said, give us your list, we'll figure it out, And we were never able to do that in the 8 years I was there. So.
Kate and Maria have tasked me to do that. So
Oh, right,
we'll see.
okay. Yes.
Yeah, I capture all the information for the 506C investors, the accredited investment filings, and the only way I can determine women is by their names. And I'm probably wrong, a certain part of the line. But there's the information that they get is not very consistent, not very good, and even when you have a full database of it, you got to spend a lot of time cleaning it to get any valid.
We should actually talk because there are these algorithms you can run through that, although that's probably a small enough sample. You could do it by hand and check LinkedIn and other places for validation.
About 1,400.
Yeah, that's doable. I have lots of research assistants. Thank you.
Yes.
Companies can have direct public offerings now and offer it to any particular affinity group, target them. What do each of you feel that the Jobs Act, Section 3 in particular, will do to make what you're trying to accomplish easier to accomplish?
Well, for us, I mean, it's just bringing new capital to the market, right? These folks who are coming in with Title III are going to be different than the current investors today, the accredited investors today. We talked a bunch about AngelList. AngelList has a new feature, which is index funds, right? So you no longer have to know about one specific company investing in an index fund. As a first-time investor, that's going to be really, really helpful. And they've kicked off, they have 5 today. I think in a year from now, there'll be 2,000, right? I mean, there's a lot of fund structures that they can set up. And for a new investor who hasn't done it before, you can have a fund for African-American founders, right? You can have a fund, a women's fund. You can have many different index funds that today, there is nothing like that on the market. You can't. If you want to do it today, you have to do it individually.
I think they are
step by
starting
step.
a women's one on AngelList. I don't
Yeah.
know if it's happened yet, but
It's not live yet, but
it's
it's
in the
coming.
midst of,
Yeah.
yeah, it is
Yeah.
coming.
But
And we have the same.
yeah, and today, if you want to go do that, you have to do it manually. You have to have the connections to the founders. It's no one person can do it. And that's going to be unlocked, I think, when Title III and new investors get on board. And then also the platforms start offering new products as well.
There, one thing we haven't talked about was Title II with general solicitation. And I think with women and minorities, that really makes a difference as well. Because then you're not just stuck with the people that you have a prior relationship with. You can actually advertise out to everyone. Of course, you can only take accredited, but you can actually really cast your net much wider to the accrediteds today. See, there was a, yes.
I had a policy question about K-12 education. I think there's things that we should be doing at that level to encourage our kids to become their own entrepreneurs.
totally agree. You know, we host an annual conference, and the last day of the conference, and Richard's been there, Chris has been there. We have 500 teams that show up, so we're planting the seeds. We're starting to look at how do we create, you know, K through 12 curriculum that could somehow be infused in either traditional, you know, context. But what we're discovering is the barrier is always going to be the deliverer. So you can have the greatest, you know, Kauffman education, you know, funded curriculum, and when it gets to that teacher who just is not passionate about innovation, not passionate about STEM, that's going to pass through to the student. So I think we have to look at alternative, whether it's online, using gamification, you know, to hear stories like when I look at kind of, you know, from an African-American context, when you hear about Troy Carter, who managed, you know, Lady Gaga and now has a $50 million venture fund. When you hear about the acquisition of Beats by Dre, you know, what it does, it gets that young person thinking about not just being the consumer, but also being the creator. And we just have to figure out collectively how we foster that in an interactive format and on a platform. And it might not just happen inside of traditional context. I mean, my wife and I, we homeschool our children, and it's by design, because we feel like if anyone's going to indoctrinate them or what we want them to know in terms of how to be viable citizens in society, we want to do that first before we send them to people we don't even have a relationship with. How policy interacts with that, you know, I don't know. But
I'll just add a quick note to that, which is also, since you brought up STEM, you know, we know that certain STEM fields are among the most entrepreneurial and lucrative. If you're looking at educational programs, a holistic approach that looks at those fields that are high growth will help, you know, demographics not only become entrepreneurs, but profitable ones, high growth ones who are setting examples and who can change the landscape in terms of diversity is another thing to be thinking about.
So if we could shift the world with this, it'll be great. Richard's told me no more questions. We're done. So I want to thank the panel for being here. Thank you so much.
Next year, you don't need to pass election, Chris.
There you go, yeah. First thing to do.